I'm Andrea Butcher, and this is Being at Work. Being a leader is hard. So on this show, I set out to talk with experienced leaders to learn from their pivotal moments, how they led through the challenges we can all relate to but are often unheard. Today, I'm joined by Matt Odum, President of Briljent, a professional services company. I have a ton of respect for Matt, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to have worked with him and his awesome team at Briljent. You see, Matt has learned that developing his team is his number one job as he runs the business. On today's episode, he talks about a situation which highlighted for him the value of giving honest feedback. It didn't unfold the way in which Matt thought it would initially, which ended up being a great leadership lesson for him. I admire his vulnerability and openness. You'll hear both of us struggle with when and how to be vulnerable. Check it out.
So I've had a lot of opportunity to learn since becoming the president at Briljent. I became the president before I was ready, and I give credit to our CEO and owner, I think, for seeing something in me that I didn't see in myself at the time. And while we didn't have the transition that I would plan for now in hindsight, it really threw me into the fire on a lot of issues that created all kinds of opportunity for me to grow as a leader, sometimes quickly, oftentimes through mistakes, and sometimes, as I think we have in this story, unintentionally, right? So one of the pivotal moments was not that long ago, and I've been the president of Briljent for 5.5, maybe 6 years at this point. So about 4 years in, I had an executive team member that I had not set clear expectations for. As she was growing in her career, I had not helped her and equipped her with the tools and the skill set to start meeting the growing expectations of somebody in her role within a growing company. And we actually engaged with a consultant to do a 360 review. And my understanding of this was that my feedback was going to be somewhat disguised amongst a group of feedback. And so what ended up happening is I answered questions more honestly than I would have otherwise. If I had known that my name was going to be attached to that feedback, my answers would have been different. They would have been the answers of an immature leader that wasn't ready to be in his position at that point. Fortunately, accidentally, that wasn't the case. So what ended up happening is within this 360, I gave this radically honest feedback that proved challenging for the executive team member to receive. It was, frankly, she was pissed off at me for 2 to 3 days and didn't voice that. She was letting it fester, letting it sit. To our benefit, to the company's benefit, she and I had a very trusting relationship. So I think that made it maybe even a little bit more painful at first and a little bit easier later. When I realized that my radically honest feedback had gotten to her desk and to her mind and to her, her being, I felt a lot of guilt over it because it wasn't intentional. However, the benefit of that has been proven ever since. So after 2 to 3 days of her getting this feedback that, again, was more honest than I probably would have done at the time otherwise, we finally sat down to talk through it with an excellent consultant that facilitated the discussion. And it ended up being not only a pivotal point for me in how valuable honest feedback is in my relationship with my direct reports, but it also just in my relationship with this leader, my personal relationship with this leader, my business relationship. Once we got through this, and it wasn't easy, but we do give each other the benefit of the doubt. We assume positive intent in our communication with each other. Once we got through how honest some of that was and how harsh some of it was, and we moved into the process of okay, how do we correct some of this, or how do we align priorities with the business priorities? I have no other team leader that we have the same amount of respect and trust within our relationship. And that's been a huge benefit to the business as a whole, because we don't worry about that. We're efficient in our meetings and our discussions and in our strategies when we're together, because we don't worry about the stuff, right? We don't worry about all the other stuff that comes with politics and and relationships at an executive level in an organization sometimes. Unfortunately, we don't see a lot of that in general in our business, but in this particular case, there's literally zero. There is so much trust and respect that it would be much harder to crack that than it is to build it more at this point. And I really go back to that singular moment of her reading this feedback that I wasn't mature enough yet to give, yet did accidentally anyway, and really the benefit we got. And so now I use a little bit more tact with my other leaders than I did even at that point, but I do get to the point, and align their priorities with the business priorities for all of our benefit and our sake, right? And so that, just a lesson that I'll probably need to learn it more than once. Like I think my style is, and my instinct is to shy away from confrontation as opposed to address it in the most positive way possible. But it's hard to admit things that you could do better that would make you better in your job, but that's one of them for me. And I think when I give the example of being vulnerable, that's beneficial to the business and our executive leadership team as well.
So good awareness on your part that that's not natural for you, but through this situation, you've seen the real value of that radical candor. In her book, Radical Candor, have you seen that book? Do you know that book? Yeah, Kim Scott, she talks about caring personally and challenging directly. And so the two of those in combination really encourage leaders to share. So it sounds like that's what you did unknowingly.
Luckily this leader knew that I cared personally. If it had been somebody else that didn't necessarily know that, I think we would have been in an entirely different situation.
It's a really good point.
That we had this assumption of positive intent in our relationship. And so she was able to get over that in a couple of days. And I was able to get over the guilt of it in a couple of days, because it was to the benefit of the business and to her benefit in her career at that point. But it just came out in a style that I don't
hadn't
typically
anticipated. Yeah. Well, and now that the feedback is out on the table, you're able to have a conversation from a really honest place. She knows where you stand, because it sounds like you hadn't had that conversation.
I thought I'd had it and she'd never heard it because of the style that I was delivering it in, right? Like I thought I'd laid this out more than once, but I was too naive, maybe even scared is a better way to put it, to follow up, to make sure that she heard what I said. I said it, so I got to check that box and walk away.
And we're good.
Yep. But I never followed up on it as well as I should have. And so the pivotal point came when that was on paper and documented and real and a little bit too honest, maybe for that point.
Well, and it sounds like it's had a big impact on your relationship with her now.
In the best way that I could have imagined. And it's not even fair to her, because I messed it up so bad at that point. I give her all the credit in the world to be coachable, to be open to that kind of feedback without just walking out the door, right? Like that could have happened because it wasn't the nature of our relationship at the time. I have different expectations with her and all of our other executive leaders now that, I care personally and challenge directly. Like that's the goal. It doesn't happen 100% of the time yet. That's part of my evolution as a leader, I think. But it certainly is the objective.
Well, and you make a good point about her being coachable. She knew that you cared. What if you are leading someone you don't have that level of trust with? They may not know that you care. How does this giving feedback, being honest, how does that show up with that leader?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think everybody has a leader like that, because not every leader's been around for 10 years. Some people are new. And so you have, my goal with all of my direct reports is to build that trust. And it takes different routes and different amount of times with different people. So it's absolutely, it's built on trust and the ability to be vulnerable, I think. That's when our relationships and our performance within the business really start to grow.
Well, and you've had to be that with them. I mean, you're vulnerable right now, sharing this story.
Yeah. Wait, this is going on a podcast?
I guess we're recording this for the world to hear.
I find value in being transparent and being just an open book, because it makes it easier to learn. There are other people out there like me, right, that have this issue I was this person. I ignored it and I didn't talk about it. And so I think putting it out there, it makes it easier. Everybody's got something that isn't perfect. And if they are perfect, well, then that's their flaw, right?
You got it. They're trying so hard to be perfect.
Right. So, I haven't always been able to be vulnerable, but that's a lesson as well that I've learned, I found value when I do that. Mm-hmm. So I stop.
How do you know? How do you know when you're being vulnerable?
I start to sweat.
I feel really uncomfortable.
Just kidding. I don't know.
When do you not? When do you know I'm not being vulnerable? Maybe that's a better question if we flip it. Because I suspect, I can relate to everything you're saying, Matt. And there's a lot of times when it's easier for me to just have the guard up, to pretend everything's okay. Mm-hmm. I don't like being in the midst of pain.
And I wouldn't even say that is, sometimes that's necessary, right? Like there are times when I've had a bad day, but when I'm walking into a meeting with our staff and I'm standing up at the front, my bad day is irrelevant at that point, right? Like I've got a staff that I hope to motivate and inspire to do great things for our clients. And
okay,
so there is
that's good.
Sometimes there's pretending involved, right?
So maybe it's what's needed in this situation right now. Yeah. And because you were talking about vulnerability as it relates to building trust. Yeah. Clearly, that's a way to build trust. Yeah. But if you're in front of your team trying to drive towards a vision or get everyone excited,
vulnerability doesn't necessarily build that, right? Mm-hmm. It might build trust. A weird path there.
Well, no, and I think it's good. This is real, right? We're being vulnerable right now. It's a challenge. I think over the last couple of years, vulnerability and all the work that Brene Brown has done, is a hot topic. Mm-hmm. But and a lot of folks are walking around with masks on. There are a lot of times I have masks on. So as a leader, I'm just kind of struggling through that, like when to be vulnerable, when to not, because it has kicked me in the ass sometimes. There are times when I have been vulnerable and it has pushed people away because the time was not right for that. Yeah.
And I, much like every other learning, is that it's a process, not an event, right? But I think that's your favorite quote. Mm-hmm. It's certainly one that we use, that I use. And I don't know that there's a great answer to that. I think that you build your instincts and intuition for when it's needed and when it's not.
So back to because we got onto vulnerability as a result of giving honest feedback. Mm-hmm. So I want to get back to that. Share with us some practical ways to give feedback. Like, what does that look like? How do you do that with your team? Yeah.
And feedback, I feel like it has a negative connotation to it, right? So I don't ever sit down and say, okay, I'm going to give you feedback. I have regular one-to-one meetings with my team in addition to our group meetings as a team. So when I have one-to-ones, I ask questions. How are things going? What more can I be doing for you? What are you struggling with? What are you really excited about? What are you happy with? Right? Those are the questions that drive those discussions that talk about feedback in a less traditional form, maybe.
I also suspect that might elicit it from them.
Totally.
Yeah. Totally. So then you can use their perspective to drive home what you're seeing.
Yeah. And when I'm doing that regularly, and when we've set clear expectations for the role, it happens on its own.
That's so good. So it starts with, in order to give someone feedback on something, you have to have set the expectation.
Yes.
There's got to be clarity around. Otherwise, you can't hold someone accountable for an expectation you haven't set.
Right. Otherwise, in my experience, the feedback is not going to be heard with the credibility that makes it actionable.
Right. It's like, where is this coming from? Right. I didn't know that this is what he expected of me.
Right.
Okay. So asking questions, clear expectations, anything else you can think of as it relates to your leadership with your team?
Yeah. We don't do like annual reviews in a traditional sense, right? I don't think that's a snapshot of that moment doesn't encompass a year or a career. So, for me, it's consistent communication and intentional probing of what they're afraid of, what they're excited about, to make sure that we're being a good employer to them, that I'm being a good manager and leader for them as individuals, along with the business.
That's good. I like that. Intentional. It's a discipline. It takes time to ask someone a question and probe into what's happening in their role. Yeah. So a lot of takeaways. I mean, we started with the value of giving honest feedback. How that played out for you is really a diamond, that one. That's a great story.
Yeah, I've learned a lot from it, and the value of the relationship with that leader is evidence itself, and it's worthwhile. But what I will also say is the work performance has improved for the sake of the company, right?
That's so good.
Organization that she leads has taken off since that point.
That's so good. Well, and the other thing, Matt, is that's a mistake, right? Something that wasn't supposed to happen.
Right.
And yet look how you've used that to grow as a leader, to better a relationship. Because this story I've heard a lot. Leaders were like, I gave feedback and I didn't realize that my feedback as a manager wasn't going to be an honest, and then they're pissed off at the assessment instrument or whoever's running the process. Or so you use that mistake to grow.
There's only going to be so many times that I get lucky enough that it works out in a good way.
Exactly.
And so let's take advantage of that time to minimize the other mistakes, right?
Yeah. So you started with the value of giving honest feedback. We talked about leading with vulnerability at the right time, and then how to give feedback, asking a lot of questions, and then using your team members' perspective to share yours. So making sure you set clear expectations so that you've got something to give feedback around. So thank you for being here. If our listeners want to connect with you, Matt, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I appreciate the opportunity to plug Briljent's social media. You can find Briljent on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, and me personally. What do you want to email? I don't know. I don't think I want emails.
Are you on social media? Do you use LinkedIn?
No, I'm on LinkedIn.
Okay,
yeah, sure.
So that'd be a good way to connect with you.
Yeah, and you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be happy to discuss any of this further. The way that it's benefited me over the past couple of years is something I'd love to share.
Good. Well, thank you. We're so grateful to have you here today and to learn from you and your mistake. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast to never miss a Being at Work story.